So what does our Fed look like? How is it structured? Well, I don't actually know much about how other central banks around the world operate, what their structure is. I basically just know some of their names and some of the news stories they've been involved in, some of the major players like the European Central Bank and the Central Bank of Japan are some of the major ones out there. But I do know that a lot of central banks aren't decentralized because they don't have to be. A lot of smaller countries have smaller regions that need to be serviced, while the United States, and this is the case with a lot of economic policy and why we need to be careful about thinking that a policy that works in a country that's more economically homogenous could work equally well in a country like the United States, where the economic diversity from one state to the next it is in large part like having a whole bunch of different countries all in one country. So our Federal Reserve System has to be decentralized. And that's one of the first things that we look at when looking at what our Fed looks like. The central Fed, in Washington D.C., where the Board of Governors operates, they actually don't do much as far as the day-to-day activities of the Fed. Instead, the day-to-day operations of the Federal Reserve System and what they do with private banks are done in various local regions. So here we have a list of the 12 different, they're called member banks. They are part of the government, though. And they are central banks of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, etc. In case you're wondering and don't know, our region, the entire state of Colorado, is within the Kansas City district. So the banks in Colorado essentially work with the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank and don't really do much with any of the others. And they don't do much with the Washington Bank. Kansas City is essentially everything, and we'll get into what I mean by everything, check clearing and so on. All of that is done through the Kansas City Federal Reserve System. So one thing that comes up when you look at this list, if you look at this list and then kind of visualize what this list looks like on a map of the United States, it seems kind of bizarre. Now, here we just said that we have a decentralized system operating through a whole bunch of different member banks all throughout the nation, and it's so that different states can be serviced according to the needs of that state without one national system saying anything about it. But when you look at this map, look at how much is going on in the Northeast. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Richmond over here, they're all very, very close together, and they service a very geographically small area when you compare that to the areas serviced by Dallas, Kansas City, Minneapolis. And of course, Kansas City and St. Louis, that's the same state, has two different central bank chapters, while a big state like Texas only has Dallas. And a big state like California only has San Francisco. None of this seems to make a whole heck of a lot of sense. So why is it like this? Why these particular places and not a more homogeneously distributed array of central banking locations geographically? Well, these 12 member banks represent what sort of centers of gravity of United States trading patterns at the time of their establishment. So you go back 100 years, this list would have made perfect sense. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, so much commerce, so much trade, and so many banks were consolidated in that region that it made sense to have 3 different central banks operating right there. Whereas when you go out west, you have a lot less economic activity as of 100 years ago. So having fewer banks out west, northwest, North Central, in the South, etc., that makes a little bit more sense. As far as points of commerce and the number of banks per square mile, the concentration of the 12 member banks makes perfect sense given the concentration of economic activity and banking activity and so on. But that's 100 years ago. Today, everything's a lot different, isn't it? Well, maybe, maybe not. Trading patterns have certainly altered. There are certain places like Denver that didn't do a whole heck of a lot of trade with the rest of the nation a century ago, but now is much, much more involved. So why not reorient these 12 member banks? Well, here's where we have to go back to what economists should do a lot more often than economists actually do, and do some real cost-benefit analysis. Too often people just do benefit analysis or cost analysis, but they don't put them together and do cost-benefit analysis. So if we had, you think about the fact that these banks operate out of offices. They have buildings and a whole bunch of people working in those buildings who aren't going to move to another state to continue working in the new building they have to operate in. And of course, they have to find a new building. And then, of course, member banks, they have a lot of automatic stuff set up, a lot of relationships that are already in place with their region's Federal Reserve Bank, and those would have to be disrupted. So you have a huge disruption in the system. You have a very costly move where some people lose their job because they can't leave the state, and then you have an understaffed new central banking headquarters and another expensive building you have to build or rent out, as the case may be, and an old building that now you have to find another use for, and a whole bunch of banks that have to change up so much of what they do as far as their day-to-day operations and reestablish new contexts and relationships and so on. And for what? That's the cost part. And what's the benefit? So that we can have a map that looks a little more sensible. I mean, there's really not much benefit there. Meanwhile, as far as different regions having different volumes of commerce that they have to address, maybe it would be nice to equalize that among the 12 banks a little bit by moving them around a little more. But this day and age of computers taking care of things in seconds that could take hours or even days back 100 years ago, the need for that sort of thing just isn't there anymore. So I would expect that these 12 member banks are going to be there certainly for our lifetime and then beyond. There's just no reason to switch it up. It's more of a historical relic, but each one of these member banks, they do a lot of work every day with a lot of banks, so it's not like they're just historical societies that don't serve any purpose. They do. But this is more a feature of history than it is of contemporary needs in the system. So the vast majority of everything that the Fed does is done in these 12 locations without one central location doing much beyond that. There is something that the central in Washington, D.C., the Board of Governors, which we'll get to, there are some things that they do that don't operate at the local level like this, but it's a small percentage of the day-to-day activities of the Federal Reserve overall. So that's what we mean by it being highly decentralized. So, about that Board of Governors. The entire system is overseen by this Board of Governors, and the Board of Governors consists of 7 people, and those 7 heads of the Federal Reserve, chairpersons. Well, there's one chairperson and then 6 other board members. They are all appointed by the president and approved by Senate. And by the president, it's a lot of presidents who do this. This is another important thing about the Federal Reserve. Remember how the founders of our country were a little skittish about that kind of centralization and power and the political types getting a hold of it? Whenever we see hyperinflation, it's because the political apparatus in a given country has too much control over the monetary authorities. So they are able to essentially counterfeit money to pay for corruption and cronyism, and that's essentially that is kind of the common denominator for most cases of hyperinflation throughout history. So most economists across the spectrum agree that central banks need to be independent, meaning politicians can't have a whole heck of a lot of control over what goes on in the Federal Reserve System. Contrary to popular belief, you may have heard a lot of people say that the Federal Reserve System itself is a private organization, and this is where you get a lot of these conspiracy theories about the New World Order and the Federal Reserve being a big part of it, and they're unaccountable to the government because they're a private organization. That's not true. They are a government institution. They were created by the government. People who work at the Fed are government employees, and again, these 7 members of the Board of Governors are presidential appointees, and they serve 14-year terms. And every couple years, a term expires, which means that the 7 members of the board can oftentimes, you can have as many as, what is that, maybe 4 different presidential administrations who are represented with them. So there isn't a whole heck of a lot of ability once they're on board for the political process to do much of anything to control them, even if a given president wants to appoint someone who's going to be radically different according to their vision of how the Fed should operate. It's only going to be a small handful of chairpersons who are going to have that president's stamp on them, unless, of course, a lot of them step down or resign or something like that and give whoever the current president is at the time a tremendous ability to staff the board with like-minded people. Not that that doesn't happen, but the 14-year terms staggered every couple of years is there to minimize the ability for the political apparatus to influence the Federal Reserve. But they are appointed by the president, just like justices are appointed by the president and then approved by the Senate. There is a political process to it. So the Federal Reserve is not completely independent, and it is certainly not a private organization. So 7 members, with 1 being appointed the 1 chairperson of the Fed, which is again at the president's discretion. And then after that, once they're on the board, they're like Supreme Court justices. They do pretty much whatever they decide to do, and they answer to themselves, which seems a little frightening. But the system has actually worked quite well to ensure that this process works well. First of all, you may also hear a lot of people say, well, we should audit the Fed, but the Fed is audited by several different organizations contracted by the government, several different levels of the government, and Congress. Congress established the Fed, and they set the ground rules for the Fed, which we'll get to. They all do plenty of auditing, and if any suspect activity is unveiled, then there can be legal consequences as they apply. But people who work for the Fed are also under a tremendous amount of professional pressure to do the job well. Anybody who sticks out too much and seems like they're trying to do things that they shouldn't be doing can find themselves having difficulty getting any respectable position elsewhere after leaving the Fed. Now, that doesn't seem like it's that you've already had a great career and you're at the pinnacle of your career if you work for the Fed. Anything after that, what does it matter what you have to do for a living? You really probably don't have to worry much. But it's still, well, if you really think about it, social pressures are incredibly powerful. So nobody wants to be that one chairperson of the Fed who just doesn't get the respect of their peers in the economic community anymore. So it's a system that works well to keep the Board of Governors as independent as possible, but it is still through a political process, so they're not a private system. You don't have to worry about the Illuminati co-opting them, at least not yet. So A little more on the structure of the Fed in the next video.